Donald Sutherland, Tommy Lee Jones, and
Mm-hmm.
Clint. So Clint came to me and he said, well, Jim, all the other guys are going to do it.
Right.
Well, okay. Then he went to the other guys and said, you know, all the other guys are going to do it.
James Garner didn't hand out compliments. He didn't romanticize people. And he didn't speak highly of someone unless they truly earned it. So when he finally broke his silence about Clint Walker near the end of his life, the things he revealed about him didn't sound like memories of a co-star. They sounded like the truth about a man Hollywood never really understood. For decades, audiences saw Clint Walker as a giant, the towering cowboy hero, the unstoppable force, the man who looked like nothing in the world could ever move him. 6'6", shoulders that filled doorframes, a jawline carved from granite, a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. He was the embodiment of American masculinity in its most mythic form, the kind of presence that made other men feel small just by existing in the same space. But James Garner saw the part nobody else saw. And when he finally talked about Clint, he didn't describe power, he described restraint. He didn't describe intimidation, he described kindness. He didn't describe a Hollywood tough guy, he described a man who was far more human and far more complicated than the roles he played. And that contradiction, that gap between perception and reality, that's what made Garner's words so powerful. Because he wasn't just correcting the record, he was revealing a truth that the industry had spent decades burying under layers of manufactured image and carefully constructed persona. To understand why Garner's words carried so much weight, you have to understand the kind of man he was. James Garner was not born into privilege, comfort, or ease. Born James Scott Bumgarner on April 7, 1928 in Norman, Oklahoma, he came from hardship, real hardship. Not the kind that gets romanticized in biographies, but the kind that leaves scars you carry forever. He came from a world where dignity had to be earned and where character mattered more than reputation. His mother died when he was just 4 years old. 4. An age when most children are just learning to understand the world, and his world shattered. His father remarried, and the stepmother was cruel. Not movie villain cruel, real cruel. The kind that damages children in ways that never fully heal. Garner endured abuse that he rarely spoke about publicly, but that shaped everything about who he became. It taught him about injustice, about powerlessness, about what it means to survive in a world that doesn't care about your pain. Growing up through the Great Depression shaped him in a way Hollywood never could. He watched his father struggle to find work, watched proud men reduced to begging, watched families torn apart by poverty and desperation. It gave him empathy, respect, and a deep appreciation for quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself, the kind that shows up every day even when hope is gone. His time in the Korean War hardened that perspective even further. He wasn't a Hollywood soldier, he was a real one. He saw combat, got wounded, Purple Heart, the whole thing. He understood discipline, sacrifice, real fear, real courage. He knew what it felt like to watch friends die, to carry guilt for surviving when others didn't, to come home and realize that nobody who wasn't there could ever truly understand what you went through. And because of that, he could always tell the difference between men who only pretended to be strong and men who truly were. Men who had been tested by something real, something that stripped away all the performance and revealed what was actually underneath. That's what combat does. That's what real hardship does. It shows you who people are when everything else is gone. That's why his characters always felt authentic. That's why audiences trusted him. Because when James Garner played someone, you believed him. You believed that the man on screen had lived through something, had earned his perspective, had paid for his wisdom with actual experience. And that's why his words about Clint Walker matter. Because Garner didn't admire people easily. He respected them when they earned it, and Clint did. But before we understand how Clint earned that respect, we need to understand where he came from. Because Clint Walker's story doesn't start with fame or television or cowboy boots. It starts in Hartford, Illinois on May 30th, 1927. Born Norman Eugene Walker, he came from hardship, real hardship. Not the kind that gets romanticized in biographies, but the kind that leaves scars you carry forever. He came from a world where dignity had to be earned and where character mattered more than reputation. His mother died when he was just 4 years old. 4. An age when most children are just learning to understand the world, and his world shattered. His father remarried, and the stepmother was cruel. Not movie villain cruel, real cruel. The kind that damages children in ways that never fully heal. Garner endured abuse that he rarely spoke about publicly, but that shaped everything about who he became. It taught him about injustice, about powerlessness, about what it means to survive in a world that doesn't care about your pain. Growing up through the Great Depression shaped him in a way Hollywood never could. He watched his father struggle to find work, watched proud men reduced to begging, watched families torn apart by poverty and desperation. It gave him empathy, respect, and a deep appreciation for quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself, the kind that shows up every day even when hope is gone. His time in the Korean War hardened that perspective even further. He wasn't a Hollywood soldier, he was a real one. He saw combat, got wounded, Purple Heart, the whole thing. He understood discipline, sacrifice, real fear, real courage. He knew what it felt like to watch friends die, to carry guilt for surviving when others didn't, to come home and realize that nobody who wasn't there could ever truly understand what you went through. And because of that, he could always tell the difference between men who only pretended to be strong and men who truly were. Men who had been tested by something real, something that stripped away all the performance and revealed what was actually underneath. That's what combat does. That's what real hardship does. It shows you who people are when everything else is gone. That's why his characters always felt authentic. That's why audiences trusted him. Because when James Garner played someone, you believed him. You believed that the man on screen had lived through something, had earned his perspective, had paid for his wisdom with actual experience. And that's why his words about Clint Walker matter. Because Garner didn't admire people easily. He respected them when they earned it, and Clint did. But before we understand how Clint earned that respect, we need to understand where he came from. Because Clint Walker's story doesn't start with fame or television or cowboy boots. It starts in Hartford, Illinois on May 30th, 1927. Born Norman Eugene Walker, he came from hardship, real hardship. Not the kind that gets romanticized in biographies, but the kind that leaves scars you carry forever. He came from a world where dignity had to be earned and where character mattered more than reputation. His mother died when he was just 4 years old. 4. An age when most children are just learning to understand the world, and his world shattered. His father remarried, and the stepmother was cruel. Not movie villain cruel, real cruel. The kind that damages children in ways that never fully heal. Garner endured abuse that he rarely spoke about publicly, but that shaped everything about who he became. It taught him about injustice, about powerlessness, about what it means to survive in a world that doesn't care about your pain. He moved to California, took acting classes, got bit parts, and then Cheyenne happened. Cheyenne wasn't just a show, it was a phenomenon. The first hour-long Western on television, and Clint Walker, this unknown giant from Illinois, became the face of it. Cheyenne Bodie, the wandering cowboy, the reluctant hero, the man who solved problems not with words, but with presence. And America fell in love. But here's what most people don't understand. That fame, that success, it didn't change Clint. He didn't become the character. He didn't start believing his own myth. He remained exactly who he'd always been, a working-class kid from Illinois who just happened to be 6'6" and look good on camera. And that's rare, because Hollywood has a way of transforming people, of taking someone genuine and turning them into something manufactured, of replacing authenticity with performance. Most actors, when they achieve that level of success, that level of recognition, they start to believe the myth. They start to become the character. They lose touch with whoever they were before fame arrived. But Clint never did that. He kept his head down, kept his values intact, kept treating people the same way he always had. And that confused Hollywood, because the industry didn't know what to do with someone who looked like a myth but acted like a regular person. Garner remembered how people reacted to Clint the first time they met him. The height, the build, the presence. Most assumed he would be intimidating, maybe even difficult. Hollywood had taught them that men who looked like that usually had egos to match, usually used their physical presence to dominate, usually made sure everyone knew they were the biggest man in the room. But Garner laughed at that idea. People always saw this huge, towering cowboy on screen, he said, but off camera, he had a warmth and humor you just didn't expect. And you could hear the genuine affection in his voice when he said it. The surprise, even years later, that Clint had defied every expectation. Clint didn't dominate people, he reassured them. He didn't use his presence to control a room, he used it to make others feel safe in it. Think about what that means. A man who could intimidate anyone, who could use his physical presence to his advantage at every turn, who could have demanded deference based on appearance alone, chose not to. Chose instead to make people comfortable, to put them at ease, to use his presence not as a weapon, but as a shelter. That's a conscious choice. That's someone who understands power and chooses not to wield it. That's someone who recognizes that just because you can dominate a space doesn't mean you should. And making that choice consistently, day after day, year after year, that takes character. Garner described how working beside Clint required awareness, not because Clint overshadowed people, but because his calm energy commanded attention. You had to keep your wits about you, Garner explained. Clint filled a room, but he was generous. He made sure everyone belonged there. And that generosity, that intentional inclusion, that was the part most people missed. Because it's easy to notice someone who takes space. It's harder to notice someone who makes space for others. That was the part Hollywood rarely noticed, because Hollywood celebrated image. Garner noticed character. And the more time he spent around Clint, the more he realized that the image was a mask. Not a deceptive one, not a manipulative one, but a mask nonetheless. Something the industry had built around Clint Walker the man to create Clint Walker the star. And underneath that mask was someone far more interesting than the myth. Someone who read books, who had opinions about politics and art and philosophy, who asked thoughtful questions, who listened more than he spoke, who thought deeply about things most actors never bothered to consider. The image suggested a simple man, a cowboy who shot straight and didn't overthink things, but the reality was far more complex. He remembered long shooting days in remote locations, harsh weather, exhaustion, pressure, the kind of conditions that strip away pretense and reveal who people really are. Desert heat that made you question why you chose this profession, cold that seeped into your bones, long hours that tested everyone's patience and professionalism. Those are the moments when a person's real nature comes through, when the performance becomes impossible to maintain, when exhaustion makes honesty inevitable, when people stop being who they want to be and start being who they actually are. And in those moments, Clint wasn't the intimidating cowboy from television. He was the person who kept people laughing when things got tough. He was the one who lightened the weight of the day, who told stories, who asked about people's families, who remembered small details about crew members' lives and followed up on them later, who noticed when someone was struggling and quietly helped without making a show of it. Garner remembered a particular incident during a night shoot. Temperatures had dropped, everyone was miserable. The director was pushing for one more take even though everyone was beyond exhausted. And Clint, who could have pulled rank, who could have demanded they wrap for the night, instead organized an impromptu coffee break, got the catering team to brew fresh pots, made sure everyone had something warm, cracked jokes to lift the mood. And when they finally did that last take, everyone was refreshed enough to nail it on the first try. Small gesture, but it revealed everything about who he was. He was the one others leaned on, not because he was strong physically, but because he was steady emotionally. And that steadiness, that emotional reliability, that's rarer than physical strength. That's harder to develop. That's something you either have or you don't, and Clint had it in abundance. You could see it in his eyes. There was a calmness there, a centeredness, like he'd made peace with who he was long ago and didn't need anyone's validation. Like he'd survived enough real hardship that Hollywood drama just didn't register as serious. Like he understood what actually mattered and what didn't. Garner admitted there were many misconceptions about Clint, created by the persona audiences fell in love with. The strong, silent type, the man of few words, the cowboy who solved problems with fists and guns. Hollywood had built an entire mythology around Clint based on what sold tickets and drew viewers. People assumed toughness equaled coldness. They assumed strength meant distance. They assumed silence meant superiority. They assumed that a man who looked like Clint must be arrogant, must be difficult, must be someone who used his physical gifts to intimidate and control. Garner rejected all of it. Clint had a sharp mind, a quick wit, and a generosity that didn't always make the headlines, he said. He was a wonderful human being, and Hollywood doesn't always talk about that side of people. Because Hollywood doesn't know what to do with complexity in men, especially men who look like Clint. The industry wants simple narratives, tough guy, leading man, action star. It doesn't want nuance, doesn't want contradiction, doesn't want someone who challenges the easy categorization. The industry wanted Clint to be Cheyenne Bodie all the time, in every interview, at every public appearance. They wanted him to live the character, to be the myth, to never break the illusion. And when he insisted on being a complete human being with interests and opinions that didn't fit the image, it confused people, made them uncomfortable, made them try to push him back into the box they'd built for him. So Garner did, because someone had to. Someone had to say out loud that Clint Walker was more than the character he played, that he was smarter than people assumed, funnier than people expected, kinder than the roles suggested, that he was a complete human being who happened to look like a mythological figure. And Garner felt a responsibility to do that because he knew what it was like to be reduced to an image, to have people see only the character and never the man, to be constantly fighting against expectations that had nothing to do with who you actually were. He'd lived that struggle himself, and he recognized it in Clint. He spoke about the era they came from, the golden age of Westerns, a time when TV heroes looked larger than life but lived under immense pressure behind the scenes. The pressure to maintain the image, to never break character in public, to understand that you weren't just playing a role, you were embodying an ideal of American masculinity that millions of people depended on for escape and inspiration. That pressure destroyed some actors, turned them into alcoholics, drug addicts, shells of themselves. They couldn't handle the weight of being a symbol, couldn't separate the character from the person, couldn't find a way to be human while the world demanded they be mythological. But Clint navigated it, found a balance, gave people the image they wanted while protecting his private self. And he did it without becoming bitter, without resenting the audience, without losing himself in the process. Fame created myths, but friendship revealed the truth. And for Garner, the truth about Clint Walker was simple. He was not great because he looked powerful. He was great because he didn't need to prove it. That's the distinction most people miss. Real power doesn't announce itself. Real strength doesn't need validation. Real confidence sits quietly and lets others discover it organically. And Clint understood that instinctively, not because someone taught him, but because it was who he was at his core. He'd been tested by real life, by poverty, by war, by the kind of challenges that forge character. And those experiences taught him that the people who talk the loudest about how strong they are usually aren't, that the ones who need constant validation are the most insecure, that true strength is quiet, patient, enduring. Working with Clint taught me humility and patience, Garner reflected. He was secure in who he was, and that kind of confidence allows everyone around you to thrive. Read that again. That kind of confidence allows everyone around you to thrive. That's the opposite of how most stars operate. Most stars need to be the center, need to be the focus, need everyone else to dim so they can shine brighter. But Clint did the opposite. His security in himself created space for others to be secure in themselves. His lack of need for validation meant others didn't need to compete for attention. His quiet strength gave everyone else permission to be strong in their own way. Garner saw this play out constantly on set. Young actors who were nervous, unsure of themselves, visibly intimidated by being on a professional production, and Clint would take them aside. Not to lecture them, not to show off his experience, but to reassure them, to share his own early struggles, to make them understand that everyone starts somewhere, that nervousness is normal, that they belonged there just as much as anyone else. And those actors never forgot it. Years later, long after they'd moved on to other projects, other successes, they'd tell stories about Clint Walker taking the time to help them when he didn't have to, when nobody would have blamed him for focusing only on his own performance. But that wasn't who he was. Coming from James Garner, a man who valued integrity above everything, that was no small statement. He didn't admire ego. He'd seen enough of it in Hollywood to last 10 lifetimes. He'd watched egos destroy careers, ruin relationships, poison entire productions. He'd seen what happens when insecurity masquerades as confidence and demands constant feeding. He'd watched actors throw tantrums over trailer size, over billing order, over whose name appeared first on the poster. He'd watched directors abuse their power because they confused authority with respect. He'd watched producers manipulate people because they believed that's what success required. And through all of that, Clint remained consistent, grounded, real. He admired quiet men who carried strength without showing it off. He admired people who treated others well when nobody was watching. That's the real test. Not how you treat people when there's a camera, not how you behave when there's something to gain, but how you treat the crew member whose name you'll never remember. How you treat the assistant who can't do anything for your career. How you treat people when there's absolutely nothing in it for you. Clint Walker was one of those people. And Garner saw it because he paid attention, because he'd come from the same kind of background, because he understood that character isn't performed, it's lived, day after day, moment after moment, in 1,000 small choices that nobody sees, but everyone feels. There were stories Garner told privately, stories that never made it into interviews. Stories about Clint stopping production to make sure a stunt person was okay. About him arguing with producers to get better pay for crew members. About him spending his own money to help people who were struggling. About him showing up to hospital rooms when colleagues were sick. About him writing letters to fans who wrote to him, actually taking the time to respond personally instead of sending form letters. One story in particular stuck with Garner. A grip on set, one of the crew members responsible for moving equipment, had a daughter who was sick, cancer. The medical bills were crushing the family, and somehow Clint found out about it. Nobody knows how. He didn't make a big announcement, didn't call a meeting, he just quietly arranged for the hospital bills to be paid. The family never knew who did it until years later when someone finally told them. That's who Clint was when nobody was watching. Small things. Unglamorous things, things that don't make headlines or build legends, but things that reveal character. And the more Garner saw, the more he respected Clint, not as a star, not as a television icon, but as a man, as someone who'd been given every reason to become arrogant, the looks, the fame, the success, and chose humility instead. There was an incident Garner rarely spoke about. A confrontation on set between Clint and a director who was berating a young actor. The kind of thing that happened constantly in that era. Directors wielding their power like weapons, breaking people down under the guise of pushing them to be better. The young actor had missed a line. Simple mistake, could happen to anyone. But the director was having a bad day and decided to take it out on the kid. Called him unprofessional, stupid, questioned whether he belonged on a professional set. The kind of verbal assault that destroys confidence and serves no productive purpose. Most actors would have stayed quiet, kept their heads down. Not their problem, not their place to intervene. The hierarchy on sets was clear. Directors had absolute power. Challenging them was career suicide. Clint stood up. Not aggressively, not trying to humiliate the director, but firmly, calmly, with the kind of strength that comes from genuine strength rather than insecurity. He simply said that the behavior was unacceptable, that everyone deserved respect, that there were better ways to direct, that mistakes were part of the learning process, that if the director had notes, he could deliver them professionally. The set went silent, everyone watching to see what would happen. Would the director explode? Would Clint get kicked off the production? Would this turn into a full-blown confrontation? And because it was Clint Walker saying it, because he had the presence and the reputation and the respect, the director backed down, apologized to the young actor, changed his approach for the rest of the shoot. The young actor never forgot it. Neither did anyone else who witnessed it. But Clint never mentioned it again, never used it to build his own reputation, never told the story to make himself look good. It was just something he did because it was right. That's who he was. And that's what Garner wanted people to understand. Because the industry has a way of reducing people to their image, of flattening complexity into marketable simplicity, of taking a human being and turning them into a brand. And once that happens, once someone becomes an icon, the person underneath gets lost. Garner refused to let that happen to Clint, at least not in his memory, at least not in the story he chose to tell. Because he understood that letting the myth replace the man was a form of erasure, was a way of denying Clint's full humanity, was reducing someone complex and complete to a two-dimensional image that fit neatly on a poster. In the end, when Garner finally spoke about him, he didn't talk about fame or ratings or television history. He didn't talk about Cheyenne's impact on the Western genre, didn't talk about Clint's film career, didn't talk about box office numbers or award nominations or any of the metrics Hollywood uses to measure success. He talked about character, about kindness, about the type of presence that doesn't disappear when the cameras shut off, the type that exists in private moments, in small interactions, in the way someone treats people when there's nothing to gain from treating them well. Because the greatest impression Clint Walker left behind wasn't the legend on the screen, it was the man who stood behind it. The man who could have been anything Hollywood wanted him to be, who could have leveraged his look and his fame into arrogance and entitlement, who could have believed the myth and become insufferable, who could have used his physical presence as a weapon, who could have demanded special treatment, who could have become exactly what people expected based on his appearance, but chose not to. Chose instead to remain the working-class kid from Illinois, the war veteran who understood that real strength doesn't need to prove itself, the gentle giant who made people feel safe instead of intimidated, the man who treated the lowest person on the crew with the same respect he showed the studio executives. And James Garner, who had every reason to be cynical about Hollywood, who had seen the worst the industry had to offer, who had spent decades navigating fame and ego and manufactured image, looked at Clint Walker and saw something rare. He saw authenticity. He saw a man who never forgot where he came from, never forgot what mattered, never let success corrupt what was good in him, never allowed fame to change his fundamental character, never sacrificed his values for convenience or career advancement. And that, more than any role, more than any award, more than any measure of fame, that was Clint Walker's real legacy. Not the cowboy on television, but the man who proved that you could be huge in presence without being small in character, that you could be famous without losing yourself, that you could look like a myth and live like a human being, that you could have every advantage and still choose humility, that you could be powerful and still be kind. That's what Garner wanted people to remember. That's what he took the time near the end of his life to make sure people understood. Because in an industry built on illusion, where image is everything and authenticity is rare, Clint Walker was real. And for James Garner, a man who valued truth above all else, that made Clint Walker one of the most remarkable people he'd ever known. Not because of what he appeared to be, but because of who he actually was. And in the end, that's the only thing that matters. Not the roles we play, not the images we project, not the myths others create about us, but who we are when everything else is stripped away, who we are in the small moments, who we are when nobody's watching, who we are when there's nothing to gain from being good except the knowledge that it's right. That's who Clint Walker was. And that's why, decades later, James Garner still spoke about him with reverence, with respect, with genuine admiration for a man who stayed true to himself in an industry designed to transform people into something they're not. If you found this story worth your time, make sure to like, subscribe, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching.